all that sort of stuff, because I didn't have red meat and saturated fat, and just got fatter and sicker. And I believed in calories, and I got nowhere as a personal trainer in comparison to what I know now and how people can achieve great things when they don't count calories. So what are your opinions about calories?
Yeah, just before I come to that, I just need to correct something you've just said in terms of red meat and saturated fat, because there's actually not much saturated fat in red meat. So one of the slides that I presented at the conference, if you take 100 grams, and I took a typical steak from the United States Department of Agriculture, All Foods database, 71% of it is water. Real food is mostly water. It doesn't matter what that real food is. It's mostly water. 21% of it is then protein. You've got some ash, you've got some minerals. In that particular example, typical steak had 7 grams of fat per 100 grams of steaks. That's 7%. And of those 7 grams, 2 were saturated. So I often say to people when dietitians say, oh, meat is full of saturated fat, I ask them to break down what a 100-gram steak actually is, because they have absolutely no idea. And the other fun thing is to say to somebody, can you find me any meat that has got more saturated than unsaturated fat? Because, of course, all foods that contain fat contain all 3 fats, saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated. So if you go to any nutritional information and look at the fat, they don't add up. They're quite frustrating in their inaccuracy, because food databases are just not that accurate. So when you've got those 7 grams of fat, you can't get the poly, mono, and saturated to actually add up to 7. It's all quite inaccurate. But you'll get the idea of which one is bigger. So add the mono and the poly, and you'll have more than you've got in terms of saturated fat. So if somebody can find me a meat that's got more saturated than the unsaturated fat, which is the mono and poly combined together, I would be interested, because I have yet to find one. But that's on meat. Calories. I mean, calories are simply a unit of energy. And the big mistake that we've made is that we have tried to convert energy into weight. And people will say, oh, you know, energy in equals energy out. It's the laws of physics. Well, first of all, there are a number of laws of physics. There's not just one. And actually, the first one doesn't say energy in equals energy out. It says in a closed system in equilibrium, energy can neither be created nor destroyed, which is not the same as energy in equals energy out. And then you need to take into account the second law, which is the law of entropy. I explain this in if you go on my website and you put in calories video in the search box, it should come up with the presentation where I go through this. So the laws of physics are about energy and not weight. And then we came up with this thing where we said, 1 pound of fat equals 3,500 calories, which it doesn't. I can make that number equal 2,700. I can make it equal 3,700. I can pretty much make it do whatever you want it to do. That is not an accurate conversion. There is no evidence for that whatsoever. I explore in that presentation where that comes from. But we then start making this weight energy conversion. And that's where you get this massive myth that every calorie counter believes, which is if you create a deficit of 3,500 calories, you will lose 1 pound of fat. That's what you're told by the people who would have you following calorie counters. And that is just one of the cruelest lies that dieters have ever been told. I can tell you a number of things might happen, but I can tell you absolutely categorically, you will not lose 1 pound for every 3,500 calories that you create as a deficit. And there are many, many reasons for that. And I explore them in the presentation, but that just does not hold. And one of the best examples that I use in that presentation is if you think about this weight energy thing that we've just slipped in, and it's our error, and we've just screwed up the whole world of dieting in doing it. You can put a lot of coal into a power station. Now that coal actually weighs a hell of a lot. It weighs tons and tons and tons and tons. And out of that power station comes weightless electricity. Now that whole process will have adhered to the laws of thermodynamics. It's not a closed system, so energy will have been lost and energy will have been used up in making that available energy. And the other laws of physics will also have applied. But we had something that had weight and we ended up with something that had no weight. And that's trying to show people that if you're going to look at energy, if you're going to try and quote the laws of physics, you've got to stick to energy. You can't then start jumping into weight, because otherwise you've got to explain how we ended up with tons and then we ended up with weightlessness. because you can't make that conversion between energy and weight in the way that we do. If you try to eat less, the body will A, try to get you to eat more. It will B, try to get you to do less. And it will C, then adjust in some other ways internally to make up for that deficit that you're trying to create. What you want to happen is what you're told in the dieting books, which is you eat 3,500 fewer calories, and the body's going to say, oh, look, there you go. There's 1 pound of fat off your waistline. That's you getting into your trousers for the party for the weekend. That's the last thing that the body will do. The body will do everything it can to stop you losing that weight, because in evolution terms, losing weight has compromised our very survival. So we can't allow that to happen.
Yeah. And it's going back to common sense. That's what it's all about. It's stored energy, isn't it, in an emergency? I just want to add something, because you mentioned about nutrition science. You don't really feel it's as honest as it could be. Well, in my area, in bloods, even in bloods, it's very vague, because one of the big things people talk about is high ferritin. And I often say, well, actually, the coefficient variant of your reading is plus or minus 25%. So that's huge. That's a huge variation in the reading. And many people don't talk about this. I've got the figures, obviously, because I do it. And I did a decade of private blood testing. You have to understand that it isn't just nutrition science. It is sort of endemic. And the way they do the labs now is definitely designed to scare people. I mean, this is one of the things, a real pet hate of mine. I used to get labs and it would just be the facts. No big red flags or graphics, with a circle putting you in the red. And it's a bugbear of mine, actually. And I think I might start doing a newsletter akin to yours, but just about bloods every single week, talking about one area where the interpretation is much more important than these little red flags and the mainstream narrative about it. So anyway, I loved what you said there.
You might really like a paper on that, actually, Stephen. There's a paper by, I think it's Fraser and Fogarty from 1989, and they looked at the accuracy of the cholesterol test. And this is even outside all the things that we know that impact it, like if you're stressed, if you've been sunbathing recently or you haven't sunbathed for 6 months, if you're running late for the appointment, what you might have eaten yesterday, which is akin to the work that Dave Feldman has done in terms of how you can mess around with your cholesterol within a 24-hour period. Aside from all of that, I think from memory, their estimate of the inaccuracy of the test was something like 19%. So if you get a cholesterol reading of, keep the numbers easy and use one of the US ones. If you get a cholesterol reading of 100, it could be 119 or it could be 81. That's a pretty big range for a particular blood measure. And that's just one that I know about cholesterol. You'll know about loads more because you've worked in that field and I haven't. But the inaccuracies on top of other inaccuracies are going to make a lot of these things completely meaningless.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And that's what I spend a lot of my time doing now. I've written a book about it. And I think people are very surprised because you do expect those numbers to be those numbers. Many people haven't got the money to prove this theory, but I do have some clients that have done, and they've gone in and then they've sat around for 90 minutes and had the test done again. And those numbers are so dynamic, and some are flagged and then they're not flagged, and the amount of time they fasted before. Anyway, this is about you, not me. Sorry. So I want you to get outside, because in South Wales apparently it's sunny. Here in Derby it's grim and horrible.
It's gorgeous.
But it is grim up north. So I want to thank you for your time. I know you're not here to plug things, but your newsletter, your website, it's golden. I tell you, it's something that I am so glad I signed up for. You're in the same company as Mike Eads and a few others.
Love Mike. It's his newsletter tomorrow, isn't it? I love Mike's.
Yes,
Friday breakfast is Mike's newsletter. I love it.
Yes, he's very funny and very good. So if you want to know more about studies or how to interpret what's happening in the media, I thoroughly recommend Zoe's website. So Zoe, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
Hi there, and welcome to another interview. Today I've got a fabulous guest who is somebody I've been following for about 10 years. Not stalking, just been online and reading lots of great information. But for those people that don't know you, Zoë Harcombe, PhD, which sounds like an American cop show, doesn't it? Who are you, and why do you think I've been following you for 10 years?
Gosh, who am I? If I sit next to people at a dinner and they say, what do you do? I probably just say I read, write and talk about diet and health. And that's it in a nutshell. If you want a sort of brief potted history, interest in anything related to food, carbohydrate, insulin, anything else, happened when my brother developed type 1 diabetes when we were both teenagers. So that was kind of my first interest. Then went up to Cambridge University, became fascinated in what was starting to emerge around me of sort of changing guidelines, eat margarine, don't eat butter, kind of all the things that I've been brought up on seem to be being turned on their head. And then started to observe people getting larger around me, people going on diets, things that just sort of didn't seem to happen back when my mum was at university probably. And then the burgeoning obesity epidemic, became fascinated in why that was all taking off. Had a proper career in parallel with all of this. So I had a proper job, went into management consultancy, worked in marketing, worked in sales, worked all over the world, had a fabulous first career, and then left all of that around 2009 to follow what had become my passion. So my first book was published 20 years ago this year, 2004. It was called Why Do You Overeat When All You Want Is to Be Slim? And it was trying to answer that $1 million question. So I guess I've been fascinated in food, diet, obesity, all of those good kind of things, probably since teenagers, but very specifically this century. And then having left the corporate world, did a PhD in public health between September 2012 and I defended my PhD in March 2016. And that PhD, I guess officially, is in public health nutrition. Very specifically, it's in dietary guidelines, dietary fat. And I do a Monday note. That's probably what I've become known for. I speak at conferences, so some of my videos online people come across. So I guess I've become known for Fibre, why you shouldn't be vegan, calories, dietary fat, a few topics. But essentially, I take an academic paper each week that might say red meat causes cancer, or if you eat whole grains, you won't get diabetes, sort of crazy stuff like that. And I dissect it so that other people don't have to. So all you have to do is do what you do, I guess, follow what I've been doing for a wee while, and then you don't have to dissect all of those studies. Just leave it to me and you can crack on doing whatever it is that you're trying to do. So that's me in a nutshell.
That's brilliant, actually. I had a little bit of a wry smile because for those people that don't know me, I have to have captions on because I can't hear very well. When Zoe said, I'll give you a potted history, she said a potty history. It's quite a potty world that we live in sometimes. So I'm going to ask you a very basic question because you do dissect the studies and you're very factual. Why do you think people get so angry about you reporting the facts?
Gosh, that is a good question, actually. There are a number of subjects that people think they know something about, and food happens to be one of them. Interestingly, marketing is another one. My brother works in marketing, and he will always say the number of people that think they know how to market things, they know how to tell people what's best for them, etc., etc. And people study marketing. It is actually a skill that can be acquired. But people think they know about food. And food is such a basic. It is one of the Maslow's basics, isn't it? We need a shelter over our heads. We need food. We need water. We need some sense of tribe and community and connection. And people think they know what they should be eating. And they take it very, very personally if you challenge what they think they should be eating, which is why it's been said of me, actually, the little quote somewhere, again, when I'm at dinner parties and people say, what do you do? And I say, I read, write and talk about diet and health. What they then tend to say is, oh, so you'll be watching what I eat. As if somehow I'm going to be judging them for what they eat. And I have to point out, I really don't care what you eat. I am not here to judge you. I really don't care. I care that you know what you should eat. And that's all I care about, because actually the government dietary guidelines are appalling. And if you follow those, you will almost certainly end up with metabolic disease, and you will end up with obesity and diabetes and possibly other conditions. So I think it's only fair that you know what you should eat, and what you then decide to do after that is up to you. But I'm not going to get into a row with a vegan or a carnivore who's trying to say how I eat is the best way to eat. Knock yourself out. Eat however you like. I know in my mind what human beings need to consume and where we find those things that we need to consume. So I'm quite happy that I know what we should be eating. What you do is entirely up to you.
Exactly. I mean, it's about an informed choice, isn't it? If you know X, Y, and Z is bad for you and you still eat it, well, let's use cigarettes as an example. I think it's pretty nailed on that cigarette smoking isn't good for you. But if you still want to do it and you know it's bad for you, well, that's great. But in the 50s, when it was being pushed as great and doctors were endorsing it and pregnant women should do this to reduce their anxiety, then you look back and you think that's crazy. How did they ever think that? So maybe in 50 years' time, people would look back about what we're talking about and think, wow, yeah, we're getting fatter and sicker, and yet they thought the guidelines were helping. You never know. That might be what happens. You mentioned that you dissect studies, and one of the things I think you're very good at, and I try to sort of say this, is don't believe me, go and find out for yourself. For instance, like a continual glucose monitor. If you think porridge oats are great for you in the morning, put a continual glucose monitor on your arm and come back in 2 weeks and tell me what's good and what isn't.
Yeah.
So let's give people a little bit of education then. So you dissect studies for people so they don't have to, but if they wanted to, can I just go through some of the things that, I think are important, and maybe you could add a bit more knowledge to it. For instance, when I read a study, I find the abstract is becoming less and less worth reading. So what is the abstract, and what are your opinions on the abstract's value?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that I do is to evaluate what level of evidence the paper is. So there's a classic pyramid of evidence, and some things in different levels vary, but as a general consensus, if you've got what we call an N equals 1, a single case study, that's right down the bottom of the levels of evidence. If you've then got a few case studies, so you might have a doctor who's written up some case reports. If I put these 10 patients on this particular intervention and this is what happened, that starts getting a bit more interesting. You get into things like reviews and opinions. They're sort of creeping a little bit up the pyramid of evidence. Then you get to the big ones that we're familiar with. So then you get to what we call the population studies, which is what a huge amount of nutritional so-called evidence is. And it's still quite a low level of evidence on the pyramid. So the population study would just be, let's follow a population over a long period of time. Let's take loads of data at the beginning, who the people are, what sex they are, what age they are, what did they smoke, what their diet was, and then just follow them. And then hopefully over 20 years, you can see the people who smoke tend to get lung cancer more than the people who don't. And that then establishes associations. And those are then supposed to be tested in what we call randomized controlled trials, which is getting up towards the top of the pyramid. So the randomized trial is taking 2 equal groups of people, randomly allocating them so you don't get all the healthy people in one group and the sick people in the other group. Do an intervention in one group, keep absolutely everything the same in the other group. That often doesn't happen. So you can still abuse random trials. And then see what was the impact of the one intervention that you made. Then you get up to what we think now is the pinnacle of evidence, although this does have caveats, and that would be something called a systematic review and meta-analysis. And what that says is, let's look at all the evidence on a particular topic. So we might, take what I did in my PhD. I want to look at all the interventions that tried to adjust dietary fat and then saw what happens. That's all the randomized trials in that field. Or I want to look at all the population studies that were trying to look at associations between dietary fat and heart disease mortality and all-cause mortality. And then you can pull all of those together in something called a meta-analysis, which is just a statistical technique that will then put all of the evidence together and say, right, when you look at all the trials in that particular area, and you put them all together, the conclusion that they come to is this. So my starting point is always, what am I looking at? And as I say, in nutrition, most of the time, I'm looking at a population study. So before I've even read the abstract, I'm thinking it's a population study. It's a pretty moderate to poor form of evidence. It can only give me association. It can't give me causation. The numbers in the paper are going to be relative risk, not absolute risk. So they're going to say, if you eat red meat, you've got a 20% greater risk of developing cancer, which will be nonsense. And I'll know it's nonsense, and I'll be able to show why it's nonsense very, very quickly. But this is all that I'm thinking before I even start looking at the paper. Because the way the relative risk works is you might have a 1 in 1,000 instance of developing cancer. So a 20% increase on that would be a 1.2 in 1,000 chance of developing cancer. Well, seriously, who cares? If I enjoyed smoking and somebody said, you've got a 1 in 1,000 or a 1.2 in 1,000 chance of developing lung cancer, I say, well, sod it. I enjoy smoking. I'm going to carry on smoking. Now, actually, the risk in smoking is very much different to that. But that's the kind of territory that you're getting into with most population studies. And then before I even look at the paper, I know that there's going to be what we call a healthy person confounder, which is that the person who eats red meat, most of these tend to be American population studies. The person who eats red meat in America is eating burgers. They're going to McDonald's or Wendy's or Burger King, and they're also eating fries and a white bun and ketchup and mustard and a milkshake or a fizzy drink or an ice cream sundae or whatever. So we're going to blame the burger for what all the carbohydrates did. So before I even look at the paper, all of that has gone in my head before I actually then go and read the abstract.
Yes, and that's one of the things that I like about you is you're very clear. I would say the absolute risk and relative risk is something that people maybe should realise is very confounding to a person, because with medications, for instance, they'll use relative risk for its efficacy, but absolute risk for its side effects. And that's one of the things that bugs me, is it's never consistent. It's always stacked in the way that the study is designed. That's leading me on to conflicts of interest. Do you think that has a big bearing on what's been reported?
Yeah, absolutely. I go as far as saying I've just done my 700th Monday note. So I think it's fair to say I've dissected a lot of papers. In fact, if anyone has dissected more papers than me in the field of diet and health, I'd be interested to meet them, because this is seriously what I do. And I've got to the realization that there is no honest research being done anymore. And that's not a too strong a statement to make. Universities are commercial entities. They need to make money. They need to fund the lecturers. They need to fund the researchers. The students pay for the privilege, I guess, of going along to the institutions, but they are commercial enterprises. And as a result, they need to attract funding. And the organizations or the industries with the funding are essentially big food and big pharma. It's not the dairy industry. It's not farmers, as in FARMERS. It's not those. It's not the individual down the road who's interested to see if kefir, for example, is particularly good for certain health conditions. And people who would want to explore those genuine kind of things don't have the money to fund the research. So the research is being funded by big food and big pharmaceuticals. And if you want more research to keep coming, you need to be publishing papers that are going to keep your funders happy. You don't bite the hand that feeds you. So I can't remember the last time I saw a paper that was truly honest, independent research. It might have come from one individual's PhD. I mean, for example, my own PhD was not funded or attracted any funding. It did upset quite a few people because it was saying things that people didn't want to hear. But it would be something like that on a really small scale that is getting out there and getting published. Most of the messages, red meat are bad for you, go vegan, don't eat animal foods. I mean, the consistent messages that we're getting are very much coming from big food and or pharma.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's very frustrating is a lot of them don't even pass the common sense test. You know, the classic M&Ms are healthier than an egg sort of thing is just it doesn't seem to pass the common sense test. And I also think just looking at the population, as the guidelines have been more and more going towards grains and carbohydrates and less meat and less healthy fats, we've just seen a rise in disease. And I think everybody can see that. So surely, if you take a really broad step back and just go, well, hang on, is this working? Get it really basic. Are these guidelines working? And the answer is no. It just seems to me that we are sort of fighting against a huge tsunami of misinformation, and it is driven by profit, I think. But there are people out there still that will say to me, really? I mean, people at the NHS, they're really in it just for the money? How would they sleep at night? I mean, it does seem strange for people to hear this, that these studies and how the media report are not actually helping people. Do you ever get people writing to you about that? Well, how do these people sleep at night when they are so obviously nefarious?
Well, that's quite interesting, actually, because who exactly is conflicted? I think a lot of people writing papers are conflicted. I think academia, there's a lot of conflict. I think there are people who work in the medical profession who are personally conflicted. And if you're getting paid nice sums of money to go and talk about a particular drug at a particular conference, you might not think of yourself as conflicted, but I think the average person would see you as conflicted. Now, for many people who are giving out this information, I think possibly they're not conflicted at the sort of nurse level. I think dietitians are conflicted. If you look at the sponsors of the UK Dietetic Association, the Australian, the American, they're heavily conflicted. But the individual dietitian might not be open to that fact, might not be awake to it. So they've had this training, or the nurse has had the training. And there are a couple of things that go on. So doctors frequently tell me they don't get any nutrition training. So if they come across a presentation of mine where I might go through what food is, what do humans need from a nutritional standpoint, where do you find those nutrients, they're blown away because they've never been taught any of this. And they actually come to the conclusion, gosh, that would have been really helpful to have been taught that during my medical training. So I think there is an element of it that they just haven't been taught the facts about food and nutrients and what we need to eat. And then there's the other side of it, that what they have been taught, they haven't learned to question. I've just been having this conversation on another podcast where I was asking somebody, why can't they realise that the dietary guidelines are just so bad for us? Why can't they see what we can see, which is that people around us are just not looking healthy? And the person's view was that throughout our entire education system, people are now taught to learn by rote and not to question. Questioning is actively discouraged in the education system, and it probably has been for many, many years. So people get to the point that they're training to be a nurse or a dietitian or a doctor or a physiotherapist or whatever, and they're taught these are the dietary guidelines, and you won't get a course approved unless you adhere to the government dietary guidelines. So it's got a way of embedding itself in curriculums, and they therefore learn what the governments want them to know, and then they regurgitate that. And they might do that for many, many years until maybe they get sick or a family member gets sick, or they see a patient who walks in who has transformed their health and they go, whoa, what did you do? And sometimes it's patients who are educating the professionals rather than the other way around.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. That is, in fact, my experience. I became a specialist practitioner in diabetes and obesity 15 years ago, before my low-carb journey started 10 years ago. So it took me 5 years to wake up. But what made me wake up was the people that were doing well. When I asked them, what are you doing? They would say, ignoring you. In a nice way, they'd say, obviously. Not as blunt as that.
Brilliant.
And it just happened time and time again. And I just realised that I was doing them a disservice. But, I think you're right. It's also about that inquisitive mind. I came from the outside. I came from a sports advanced personal training background, and I wanted to get into diabetes for a particular client who ended up at the Olympics, by the way. It's a type 1. So I was quite proud of what I was doing. But we were doing everything that we shouldn't, in inverted commas, to get to there. But anyway, I suppose the three big things you mentioned that you're sort of also famous for is talking about particular areas, which you mentioned were fibre, saturated fat and calories. So I'd be an idiot if I didn't get your opinion on those three things. and then you're done. You can go out and look at the sky and get away from a screen. So, Zoe, fibre. What's your opinions on fibre?
It literally is indigestible many sugars. That is the definition of fibre. If you go through carbohydrate 101 in terms of monosaccharides, single sugars, disaccharides, two sugars, polysaccharides, many sugars, fibre literally is a polysaccharide that we can't digest. So indigestible many sugars. That just straight away says to me that's something that we shouldn't be consuming. I did a podcast the other day and the interviewer put it brilliantly. I loved it. I said, please tweet that and I'll retweet it. And he said, the purpose of digestion is to extract the nutrition from your food. It's not to produce waste. So this whole idea, because fibre is just waste, this whole idea that somehow fibre is a good thing, producing waste is a good thing, consuming stuff that we can't digest is a good thing, it's just completely ludicrous. I actually think it's because they've realised that of the three things that we eat, carbohydrate, fat and protein, there are essential fats, there are essential proteins. Those two we do need to eat. There are actually no essential carbohydrates. So carbohydrate we don't need to eat. And I think having realised that it is actually indefensible to be telling us to eat carbohydrate at all, let alone 65 to 70% of our diet in the form of carbohydrate, I think they've tried to come up with some narrative of there's got to be something good about carbohydrate. And of course, fibre is a subset of carbohydrate. You only find fibre in carbohydrates. So if you can get this narrative going that fibre is completely essential and it's so important for your gut and this, that and the other, then you've suddenly got some rationale for continuing to tell people to eat carbohydrate. But I think when the fibre dragon falls and it needs to be slayed, there is no remaining defence for carbohydrate that they're going to be able to put in front of people. And I think we need to get there because we need people really to be thinking, I'm not saying don't eat any carbohydrate. I eat a reasonable amount of carbohydrate. I think it's just important that people realise that we don't need to eat it. And if you're eating it in the amount that governments are telling you to eat and therefore crowding out the fat and protein that you do need, you're going to end up unhealthy. So we've got to fight this carb fibre dragon in some way. Otherwise, people are going to carry on getting overweight and sick.
Well, yeah, that's brilliant. It's pretty much how I feel. But just plain devil's advocate, many people say, but what about feeding our gut bacteria? Don't we need all that fermentation from the fibre? What would you say to that?
No, I mean, there are so many other things that will look after your gut flora. Some of them you can't do anything about. So I go through this in my fibre presentation. Ideally, you should be born to healthy parents. Ideally, mum should have stayed healthy during pregnancy. Ideally, mum gives birth to you naturally because you will then get bathed in gut flora as you're being produced, as you're coming out into this world. Ideally, mum will then breastfeed for as long as possible. Ideally, mum then won't give you any antibiotics as a child unless your life depends on it. Ideally, if you have to have antibiotics, you have probiotics at the same time. Ideally, you have a great real food diet from the moment you're born into adulthood. Ideally, you keep that going. Ideally, you reject antibiotics as an adult. There are so many things that are going to protect your gut flora. And then there are a number of foods that will feed your gut flora, but none of them need to contain carbohydrates. So, for example, blue cheese, kefir, if these things even contain a trace of carbohydrate, they're not good for you because of the carbohydrate gram per 100 gram that might be in there. They're good for you because they're fermented foods, because they naturally contain gut things that feed your gut flora, like the lactobacillus, Staphylococcus, and all of those kind of good things. So eat real food, don't eat junk. Junk is going to feed the bad guys that are going to then destroy your good gut flora. So there is an absolute ton of things that are going to keep your gut flora healthy, and absolutely none of them have got anything to do with baked beans on toast, which is what the fake food companies want you to be eating, or all bran, God forbid. I mean, can you imagine how much sugar they have to put in all bran? Because if they didn't, how it would actually taste.
I mean, I did my alpha diversity, my gut bacteria test recently, and as a 6-year carnivore, everyone's very upset when I say that it came back as ideal, because that just goes against the narrative. But that was an independent lab. I've got the test right. So 2 to go. as it is the big one that you're definitely known for, as you say. I'm going to just praise this. I can't believe that LDL, for instance, is still hanging around with, so much information about feeding rabbits, starting it off, and fraud from the Sugar Research Foundation, that LDL is still hanging around as a theory. So I'll put them together, even though they shouldn't really be. Saturated fat and LDL, why are people still so worried about those two things, and why shouldn't they be?
Well, it goes back to the beginning of the last century when the Russian pathologists, and because they're pathologists, they're looking at people who've died. So they're opening up the bodies, doing a pathology, doing the autopsy on men, particularly who had died suddenly. And we didn't even really have the term for heart attack back then. I think heart attack sort of comes into the classifications of death somewhere around about 1948. So they're opening up these people who've died suddenly. They're seeing blocked arteries. They're seeing at the scene of that damage a number of lipidy substances, one of which would be cholesterol. So there was this hypothesis that cholesterol has actually caused the damage, that has narrowed the artery, that has then caused this sort of sudden heart attack or whatever. Cutting a long story short, the cholesterol is actually there to repair the damage that has been caused to the artery by probably a myriad of other things. Maybe, well, yes, back then they would have had smoking, they would have had sugar, they would have had stress, not least war and poverty and where your next income is going to come from. Those things damage arteries, and then the body will try to send lipids to that area to repair the damage. That's where this sort of whole hypothesis came from. Ancel Keys then comes along in about the 90s, and he was looking at, does cholesterol cause heart disease? So he was looking at dietary cholesterol. He tried to feed human subjects massive amounts of dietary cholesterol, found it made no difference whatsoever to their blood cholesterol. So he kind of abandoned that one. He did conclude it around the time of doing the 7-country study. Cholesterol itself really now isn't in my mind anymore, but I think there's something going along with total fat. So I think total fat in some way is related to heart disease, particularly, again, he's looking at men. Nobody was ever studying women. So he wanted to explore that further. And he went into the 7-country study, which started in 1956, was published in 1970, thinking that it was total fat that was the issue. And it actually came out of the 7-country study. Not many people know this, thinking, well, actually, I didn't find anything related to total fat and heart disease or deaths from heart disease or anything else going on. But there seemed to be this sort of association with saturated fat. And that was essentially one of his weak conclusions from the 7-country study. Again, the conclusions of that study are really not well known. People have clearly not read it who quote it. And I really have read it because it was the background to my PhD. And when you look at the detail of the diet that he was referring to in the 7 countries and the 16 cohorts within those 7 countries, he was talking about things like cake and ice cream. Now, okay, they might contain saturated fat, but then, as I showed at a recent presentation where we met, strawberries contain saturated fat. So don't blame the saturated fat for what anything else in the food did, particularly sugar and flour, in the case of cakes, and sugar and probably vegetable oils at that time in the case of ice creams. Lots of associations. I mean, it's back to this weakness of evidence. Associations have built up over the years that just do not withstand scrutiny. People then talk about them without actually knowing what they're talking about. The number of times I'm at conferences and people misquote Ancel Keys or the 7-country study, or there is another 6 countries graph, which has actually got nothing to do with the 7-country study whatsoever. And I get really annoyed because if people are going to start talking about this area, they need to know what they're talking about. So it's just vague associations that have kind of been connected. And we come to today where cholesterol lowering is a fantastically lucrative industry. Vegetable fats are very lucrative compared to natural animal fats. So we're back to the food industry and the pharmaceutical industry who have an interest in these topics, but they've got very little to do with actual facts and actual health, which somebody would know if they'd looked into the science in this area.
Yeah, it is a frustrating area. And even people on our side, in inverted commas, do quote some things that aren't quite right. So I'm going to finish with calories. because this is something close to my heart, because I really fell for, well, I fell for everything. I followed the guidelines from, well, age, 1, whatever, because my mother did and my father did. They followed it. So I inherited that. That's why I got bad teeth and